She had worked in this bakery for 3 years. In a town of that size, almost nobody knew her name. He was the most eligible man in the county, and he came back every single morning for bread. Most women in town knew his name and had tried to make sure he knew theirs, but he spent his mornings buying her bread anyway. The town never understood why. She wasn't sure she did either, until he asked for her hand. Tobias James came to the stall on a Tuesday. She did not know him then, only that he was well dressed in the way that was not performed, boots worn but maintained, a coat that had cost something and been kept. He stopped at her stall the way a man stops when he has actually looked at what is in front of him. He picked up the rye loaf and turned it once in his hands, not inspecting it, reading it, the way a person reads something they understand. He set it back down, bought it, set the coin down clean. Then he looked at her directly, not at the bread, not past her, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." She had been selling bread for 3 years. She could not have said the last time someone had called her that. He took his loaf and went. She watched him go without meaning to. Across the street, on the boardwalk outside the dry goods store, a woman in a good dress stood with a basket on her arm and watched him walk away. Her name was Cecilia Holt, the bank manager's wife, a woman who had spent the better part of a year arranging occasions for her younger sister to be in Tobias James's vicinity. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went into the dry goods store without buying anything. Dolly had seen all of it. She straightened her loaves and said nothing to anyone. She had been at the stall since before the roosters finished their argument with the morning. First loaves out by the time the street was still gray, the dough turned and rested and turned again in the dark of the room she rented above the tanner's. Most people who stopped bought without looking at her. Eyes on the bread, coin on the board, bread lifted and gone. The ones who didn't stop looked through her the way people look through things that have always been in a particular place. She was not unhappy. She had not expected more than this, and the work was honest and the bread was good, and those two things together had always seemed like enough. He came back the next morning, and the one after that. She found out his name from women passing the stall, speaking freely the way people speak freely in front of furniture. Tobias James. Land north of town, the best spread in the county by most accounts. Not married. That last fact delivered with the particular emphasis of women who considered it a situation requiring correction. By the end of the first week, she understood it was going to be a pattern. She put the rye at the front of the board without examining why. What she noticed, and tried not to notice, was that he did not rush. Most men at the stall were in transit, the purchase a thing accomplished on the way to something else. He stopped, as if stopping was the point. Once, at the end of the first week, he told her the crust on the white was better than what the hotel dining room served. Not as flattery, just as information delivered to the person responsible for it. She thanked him, and he went. She was 31 years old, and had learned a long time ago not to expect things. She picked up her cloth and wiped down the board and started the afternoon batch. By the second week, the town had noticed. Mrs. Pruitt watched from the far side of the street one morning as he tipped his hat to Dolly and walked away with his loaf. She stood there a moment after he'd gone, then moved on without buying anything from anyone. By the third week, Ada Greer was saying it plainly on the steps of the general store, loud enough to carry. "Why does he keep stopping there?" Not a question. The kind of thing women say when they already know the answer and find it incomprehensible. Every single morning, he could send his man. Dolly heard it, kept her hands on the bread. She did not understand it either, but she kept the rye at the front of the board and did not examine why. She saw him once away from the stall, early in the second week. Carrying flour from the mill, she passed the livery and saw him crouched beside a horse, a gray with a bad foreleg, standing with its weight shifted wrong. He ran his hand along the leg the way she ran her hand along dough, not pressing, reading. He said something quiet to Hector Marsh, who ran the place, and stayed there with his hand on the animal and his voice low and steady until it stopped pulling against him. She went and got her second sack of flour, but she thought about those hands on the way back, the particular patience of a person who understood that some things could not be rushed and did not try. It was a Thursday when she left the gift. The week prior he had come early to find her struggling with the corner post of the awning. The wind had gotten under it and the whole frame was listing. He had not asked. He had put down his coat and fixed it. 20 minutes of actual work while she held the brace, the two of them not speaking, the post going back true. Then he picked up his coat and bought his bread and said, "Thank you, ma'am," the same as always, as though he had not just spent 20 minutes on his knees in the dirt for her. She baked a small honey cake, wrapped it in cloth, left it at the door of his office before dawn, her name nowhere on it, and went back to the stall before the town was up. He said nothing about it. She decided she'd been foolish and did not think about it again, or tried not to. The fever came on a Wednesday toward the end of October. Word reached her through the boy who sometimes helped carry flour. Mr. James had been down 2 days, and the housekeeper was out at her daughter's. Dolly stood with a sack of cornmeal in both arms and thought for one long moment, and then set it down. She told herself she was returning a kindness. The awning post. She was settling a debt. She brought broth and knocked on the door of his house on the north end of town. Solid house, wide porch, a horse in the pen looking at her with mild interest. The housekeeper's neighbor let her in, grateful and already putting her coat on. He was in bad shape, not dangerously, she could see that quickly. But the fever had him, and the room had the stale heat of a sick room nobody had been managing. She opened the window a crack, got water, sat in the chair beside the bed and did what needed doing. Compress replaced when it warmed, water given when he surfaced, broth when he could manage it. He spoke her name once, unclear, sometime in the middle of the night. She replaced the compress and let him sleep. Around 4 in the morning the fever broke. She felt it go. The particular shift in his breathing, the sweat that meant the body had finished its argument. When gray light came through the cracked window, she rose to go. At the door she looked back at the room, the chair, the basin, the glass of water, and on the shelf above the writing table, the cloth, her cloth, clean and folded, sitting among his things like it had always belonged there. She looked at it a moment longer than she meant to. Then she pulled the door closed and went back to start the morning loaves. He was back at the stall the following Monday, thinner in the face. She could see him deciding whether to speak, about the cloth, about the nights, about any of it. He set his coin down. "Thank you, ma'am." She understood then that he was not a man who would make a production of what she had done, that the word carried everything he meant to say about it. She handed him his bread. Neither of them looked away for a moment too long. It was a Thursday, still early in November, and it was raining lightly, just enough to silver the street and make the morning smell of wet wood and cold. She had moved the loaves to the dry end of the board before the first customers arrived. He came at his usual hour and looked at the board, at his loaf, already at the dry end, moved there before he'd arrived. She had simply done it. He looked at it, then at her, set his coin down, and stood at the edge of the awning with his collar turned up, looking at the gray street as if deciding something. Then he looked back at her once more before he went. Cecilia Holt passed 20 minutes later with her basket and her good dress, and did not stop and did not look at the board. Dolly watched her go and kept her hands moving. The walking home started on a Monday evening, 6 weeks after the fever. She was packing the remaining loaves when he appeared. Later than his usual hour, no explanation offered. When she lifted the crate, he took the other end without being asked. They carried it to the room behind the Tanners, and he told her it was on his way, which was not true, and they both knew it, and neither said so. He came back the following Monday, and the one after that. It became the shape of certain evenings, without either of them naming it. The conversation stretched gradually. She found herself saying more than she intended. The flour from Wichita that had arrived inferior 2 months running, the clay oven in dry weather, how the left side always ran hotter, and she had learned to rotate the loaves to compensate. He listened the way people listen when they are actually interested, and asked questions that showed he had retained the answers from the week before. One evening she said, practical, no weight on it, that a proper oven would double what she could produce, that the clay oven was what it was, but there were things it simply could not do. She said it without asking for anything on the back of it, and moved to the next thing, and did not look at his face. He went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. She noticed without remarking on it. One evening, walking back, he told her his father had been calling him Jim since he was 6 years old, and he had never once liked it. She looked at the ground to keep from smiling. He caught it anyway and did not seem to mind. The next morning she handed his bread across the board and kept her face level. "Morning, Jim." A long, flat look. He took his bread. "Ma'am?" he returned with some effort, and walked away. She waited until his back was to her before she let herself smile. It was a thing she had not done easily in some time. She noted this and put it away and went back to work. Mrs. Fenwick came to the stall on a Friday afternoon, not to buy bread, which was clear enough from the way she arrived. She stood at the board and spoke with the voice of organized concern. She had known the James family for many years. A man in Tobias James's position required a particular kind of partner, someone with standing, with social ease. She had a young woman in mind, a Miss Lottie Aldridge, whose father had land east of the county and whose manners were, by any reasonable measure, what the situation called for. She let that sit. Then she said nobody meant anything unkind, that a simple girl was a fine thing to be, that there was dignity in good, honest work. She walked away without buying anything. Dolly wrapped a loaf that didn't need wrapping and kept her hands busy until the heat in her face had passed. She was 31 years old and had learned not to expect things. She did not think about Lottie Aldridge, and tried, with partial success, not to think about Monday evenings either. The confrontation came on a Friday morning, full street. Mrs. Fenwick had positioned herself with 2 others near the stall, not shopping, positioned. She spoke in the voice of someone raising a concern for the common good. A man of Mr. James's standing. Community expectations. The word appropriate used several times in ways that meant many things, none of which were said plainly. She mentioned Miss Aldridge once, like a card placed on a table to show what was being held. Dolly's hands were on the board. She kept them there. Toby had come at his usual hour and was standing 3 feet away with his bread in his hand. He listened to Mrs. Fenwick finish. Let the silence sit. Then he turned to Dolly first, brief, steady, the look of a man checking that someone is still standing, and turned to Mrs. Fenwick. "My father built his first house with a carpenter's daughter. Not raised. Nobody in this town would speak poorly of my mother." He looked at Dolly once more. "Ma'am." Deliberate now. A declaration made with one syllable in front of everyone who needed to hear it. He walked up the street. The crowd thinned. Dolly straightened the loaves and watched the street go back to its business, and did not let her face do anything until the last of them had gone. On Wednesday, he did not come. She had the rye out at his usual hour, the way she always did. The hour passed. 2 customers stopped, and she served them and kept her hands busy. At noon she wrapped his loaf in cloth and set it under the board. She told herself she would leave it for whoever wanted it in the afternoon. She did not. At the end of the day she put his wrapped loaf in the crate last, carried it back to the room above the tanner's, and set it on the table, and looked at it a moment. She went to start supper, and left it where it was. It was still there in the morning. She did not throw it out. On Friday, he came at his usual hour and told her, before he turned to go, that he had ridden to Abilene on Wednesday to file the deed on the building. The county recorder kept short hours, and he had needed the full day. He said it plainly, without decoration, and picked up his bread and went. She stood there a moment after he'd gone. The deed. She picked up her cloth and wiped down the board, and did not examine what had loosened in her chest. His father came to town on a Saturday. Older version of the same face, broader in the shoulder. He came to the stall alone and bought a loaf of cornbread, and looked at her in the straightforward way of someone who has come to form an opinion and intends to do it accurately. He looked at her hands on the board. Good hands for the work. She thanked him. He turned the loaf once. "My son is a serious man. Doesn't do things without reason." A pause. "Asked me specifically not to come." She kept her expression level and her hands moving. He looked past her toward the end of the street. Toby was there, had come looking, had seen them, had stopped. The 2 men held each other across 30 feet of Main Street, something passing between them that had the shape of an old argument and the weight of genuine affection underneath it. Then Toby walked toward them and came to stand beside her at the stall without a word to either of them. The older man looked at his son, at where his son had chosen to stand. He tucked the cornbread under his arm. "Jim never did like that name." She kept her face straight. "I expect that's his own business." He looked at her for a moment. Then he walked back up the street. Toby watched him go, set a second coin on the board, a second loaf he didn't need, and went without a word. She put the coin in the box and went back to work. He showed her the building on a Monday, 3 weeks after his father's visit. 1 street off the main. Solid structure, good bones, proper oven space, and a window that caught the afternoon light and threw it across the floor. He opened the door and stood back and stayed quiet while she moved through it. A real oven, brick, deep, holding heat evenly across the whole chamber. She checked the flue, ran her hand along the counter, plank wood wide and solid the length of the far wall. On the shelf above it, canning jars caught the afternoon light and held it amber. She understood, standing there, that he had been listening, that the evening she had spoken about the clay oven and what it could not do, he had heard it not as conversation, but as information, had come here and looked at this room and thought about her hands and what they were capable of, and acted on what he thought. She had not asked for any of it. He had simply done it the way he did everything, quietly, after he had already decided. She turned around. He was watching from the doorway with his hat in both hands. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the decision already made in his face. "It's yours. The deed's done." He turned his hat once in his hands, set it on the counter, looked at her the way a man looks when he has finished deciding and is ready to say the thing out loud. "I'd like you to be my wife, Dolly." The room held the afternoon light. Outside, a horse shifted in the street. She looked at this man, who had crouched beside a lame horse with patience and no audience, who had fixed her awning post without being asked, who had kept a piece of cloth on his shelf, who had said ma'am to a bread seller every morning for months because that was simply who he was. She was 31 years old and had learned not to expect things. She looked at his face and understood that the learning had cost her something and that she was being offered it back. She reached out and took his hand, turned it over, looked at it. She looked up. "Yes." He let out a breath, long and slow. His hand closed around hers. They were married on a Thursday in December. 5 weeks later, the church cold enough that breath showed. Word had traveled the way it always traveled, steadily, through parlors and dry goods counters and church steps, until everyone knew. Tobias James, the bread stall. A deed already signed before the question was asked. That last detail traveled fastest and landed differently depending on who received it. The women who had watched him stop at that plank board every morning received it in silence, which was its own kind of answer. Toby at the front did not look at the pews. He looked at the door. When she came through it, he watched her walk the full length of the aisle, and his expression did not perform anything. It just opened. The way a room opens when a window is raised. After, outside in the cold air, the usual words. And then Mrs. Fenwick with 2 of the same women from that Friday morning, her face arranged into practiced warmth. Behind them, a little apart, Cecilia Holt stood with her basket. She looked at Dolly for a moment, level, without hostility, and nodded once, small and plain, before she turned and walked up the street. That was all. It was enough. Mrs. Fenwick said how lovely, said what a change this must be, said carefully, the blade inside the flowers, that it was good, Dolly would have a different life now. That status had a way of lifting a person, given the right circumstances. Dolly looked at her with the patience of a woman who had spent years standing still while people decided things about her. "Mrs. Fenwick, I made your husband's bread every Tuesday and Friday for 3 years. I am the same woman I was then." She let that sit. "We always were the same, you and I. I hope you'll come to the bakery." Mrs. Fenwick opened her mouth, closed it. Toby appeared at Dolly's side, offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked to the carriage, and the cold air came off the flat land steady and clean. The bakery opened on a Wednesday in January. She was alone in the room before the town was up. The oven had been going since 4, and the heat of it had reached every corner, that particular warmth that only exists when a fire has been working for hours in a closed space. The bread smell was in everything, in the walls already, in the wood of the counter. The morning light crossed the floor in a long, pale strip, and the canning jars on the high shelf caught it and turned it amber. She stood with her hands flat on the counter, her oven going steady behind her, and the weight of what that meant moved through her slowly, the way warm water moves. She turned toward the oven before the feeling could reach her face. She was still standing that way when the door opened. Toby came at the same hour he always had. He stood in front of the counter, and looked at the loaves laid out in order of size, the same order, carried from the stall into this room like something that belonged here all along, and then at her. She had his rye ready. He set his coin down, looked at her. She looked at the coin, this ritual between them now, no longer payment, something else entirely that neither could have explained. "Ma'am?" Quietly. A private thing. She left the coin on the counter and went back to her work. He took his bread and went. The door closed, and the room held the warmth of the oven and the light coming clean through the window and sitting still on the floor. 2 months later she knew, before she could have said how. Something had shifted in her body that she recognized before she had words for it. She waited a week. She needed it to herself before it belonged to anyone else. On a Saturday morning he was at the kitchen table with the week's accounts, the stove going, the room carrying the smell of something with molasses cooling on the rack, a new recipe, not quite right yet. She came to the table and stood until he looked up. She was carrying his child. She told him so plainly, the way she said everything that mattered. He set his pen down, looked at the table for a moment, just the time it took to move something from one place inside himself to another. Then he came to her and put both hands on her face and looked at her and said nothing. She put her hands over his. Outside, a woman called to her child, ordinary, unhurried, the sound of a morning that had no idea it was any different from the one before it. A door opened somewhere and closed again. The town went on doing what it always did, and now it contained this too, quietly, without knowing it yet. The bread cooled on the rack. The stove ticked. The morning held them both.